Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of what I think will probably be three videos ahead of your English language assessments to come. Probably two for section A and one for section B. And certainly in this one, it'll be the questions one and two that we'll be focusing on. Now, I don't think there'll be very much at all that will be new to you in this, but once again, what's hopefully valuable about these videos is the revision aspect, going over those helpful things that you've come before and hopefully filling those minute gaps in your knowledge. So, to move on then, let's start and have a look at that. So, quick reminder of what this would normally look like. Um, Obviously, then for your English language GCSE, there would normally be two exams, although for this particular assessment series, we're just doing the one, which will be paper one. So, what does that include? Well, it includes one extract from a novel or a short story, and it will always specify whereabouts in the text, for example, the opening or the middle or something like that. Because, particularly for the structure question, but more generally, that obviously is useful information in terms of what exactly a writer is trying to do at any given point. Um, Section A then, four questions that will get harder, more progressively harder towards the end, with a focus on reading. The breakdown of marks being 4, 8, 8, and 20, so a total of 40 marks for that. And section B, one question on the writing, descriptive or narrative, and that will be worth 40. The two halves of the paper, therefore, having equal weighting. Um, 80 in total. Now, the normal timing for that would be 1 hour and 40 minutes. Now, again, for this particular series, that is actually going to go up because you have 1 hour and 15 for the section A, an extra 15 minutes for that. And then you also have, I think, 1 hour for section B, so an extra 15 minutes for that over what you would normally have under usual circumstances. So a little bit of a bonus there. Right then, before we start on the particular questions then, just two general notes that are worth mentioning. Kind of fairly commonsensical, but nonetheless worth mentioning. So, the blurb then, to begin with, which will always have a couple of sentences of useful background information that will help you to understand and interpret the extract that you are given. It's always worth a read and a little bit of a think because it will help you, and no doubt there will be aspects of the text, because it's specifically written for the exam, there'll be aspects of the text that it may well specifically help you to interpret. One mistake, though, that some people make is actually that they will end up quoting from the blurb as a part of your answer, and even I've known cases where people have actually analysed language from the blurb. Obviously, that's not a very good idea because it's sort of meant to sit outside the text. Essentially, the part of the text that you're analysing starts on line one and moves onwards. So just it's the sort of silly mistake that sometimes people might mistake under pressure. Don't do it. On the subject of glossaries, it's also worth checking the ending of the extract, because sometimes there'll be a couple of words there as a glossary with the meaning of one or two things that the examiner thinks are relatively unusual, relatively uncommon words that they think are both unusual but also important in terms of the meaning of the text. So it's always worth a check, perhaps even before you read the text, but that's just a couple of things that sit outside it. So the other thing that's worth bearing in mind is that apart from the glossary, it is often the case that there will be other occasional words and those in that extract that you don't understand. It's just one of those things. But the key thing is keep calm. It's very rarely critical to your understanding of the extract. Focus your attention on other parts that you do understand. I sometimes think that if people find something that they don't understand, it almost has a magnetic effect on them because people almost feel compelled to include it. Because they think, oh, if they don't understand it, perhaps it must be important. But no, if avoid, because ultimately, if you are analysing something like that, then there's a very real risk that you'll actually end up saying that something that is actually wrong. Having said that, though, often you can get a rough idea of meaning by looking at the context and the sentence around it, or by breaking down the word itself. So a couple of examples here. So it says, when we reached the open sewer, the smell was malodorous. Now, straight away, you can look at that and think it's an open sewer, deducing it's not going to be something good. It's going to be something that's got a kind of fairly negative connotation. And if you start to break that down, mal, odor in the middle, odor. Oh, recognize that. That means smell. Mal, if you do French or Spanish, something bad, a bad smell. That makes sense. So you can work these things around like that. And sometimes, again, the context, if you look at the second example, the mood in the exam hall was melancholy and disconsolate. Now, again, you can extrapolate your own experience and your own knowledge of that, and you can very much deduce that it's not going to be a happy word again. And similarly, in the case of that, when you have it two adjectives together, melancholy and disconsolate, it would be very strange in that situation if the second word somehow meant happy. It would make much more sense if it was going to be similar in meaning to melancholy. So just a quick reminder of the kind of approaches that you can take. Again, it's commonsensical, it's nothing new, but it's worth bearing in mind. Right, so question one then, if we move on to talk about that. Now, I often think that it's worth doing question one without even reading the rest of the text. My inclination would be to simply focus on the bit that it says for this first. Um, so, You'll see here then the guidance on the left, which gives you some instructions about what to do. Starting at the top though, 4 marks, 5 minutes max for this question. It's designed to be very easy, and it is, as long as you don't trip up on one or two very obvious pitfalls that very, very occasionally people do find. So, what then does the question look like? Well, it will say, read again the first part of the source from lines 1 to 7. As I said, I would perhaps just read it for the first time. It's often worth circling the actual extract that you're looking from, because it just encourages you not to accidentally stray outside it. And the question lists 4 things from this part of the text about the weather in Cornwall, is the particular focus of this question. This is from the Jamaica Inn paper that you all did sometime before Christmas. So what is it asking you to do? Well, to retrieve 4 facts from the opening of the source text. Literally 4 simple facts. It's only worth 4 marks, 1 mark each. It doesn't need anything complex. The question will always have that list 4 things about format. It says that you can answer with a quotation or your own words or a mixture, but it must be a full sentence. That is very important. A short sentence, fine, but it must be a full sentence. It's only a mark each, so keep your answers short. And be careful that you read the focus of the question. The classic example was a paper years ago that said something along the lines of list 4 things about David Beckham's charity work. So anybody who wrote 4 things from the extract about David Beckham's football career obviously straight away lost the mark. So it is just important that you do follow that, and people sometimes do drift from that, especially if there's something else that's a bit related. I'll look at an example of that later. Right then, common mistakes that people make for this question. Well, first of all, people often don't read it properly and answer on the wrong thing, as I've mentioned. Secondly, people will try to overcomplicate it. Sometimes they might end up making 2 or 3 points in one. So even though it's only worth 4 marks, overall they might actually have written enough to get 10 marks, if such a thing were possible. Well, that's clearly just a waste of your time. You're looking to make one simple point, one simple fact. People sometimes try to infer, they'll try to read between the lines, and again, that this is not asking you for anything like that, this question. It is asking you for 4 simple, sort of surface level bits of information. And finally, if people don't answer in full sentences. So they're the common things that people often do that they shouldn't. It's just 4 basic facts. If you've got one that seems doubtful, just choose a more certain one, because there will always be plenty of alternatives. I would say on the mark schemes for this question, there is always 2 or even 3 times the actual number of possible answers. That, 2 or 3 times the number that you require. So if there's one you're not sure about, don't risk it, just pick a better one. In terms of how to actually style that, well, the possible answers then, there's 2 ways really of doing that. So first of all, the first bullet point here, the answer with an integrated quotation from the text. So there it says, the speaker returned from the city at about 3 o'clock. What you've done there is to take the quotation from the text and then just simply make it into a sentence with the addition of that first 2 words. That works fine. Okay. However, that is by no means necessary. What you can also do is you can paraphrase the information from the text as well. So, for example, there, the speaker came back from the city at 3 o'clock. It's the same information, but simply you put it into your own words, and either way doesn't matter. They're completely valid because they're both communicating the same simple fact. But notice, not just return from the city, or even return from the city at 3 o'clock. Because the issue is that what it says here, remember, you must answer in full sentences. Brief answers with only odd words are potentially meaningless and may confuse the examiner. Um, if the question asks you about the speaker or David Beckham or the weather or whatever it happens to be, I would refer to that at the start of each line. The weather is, the speaker is, David Beckham is, something like that. Okay, it just needs to be a simple sentence, but make sure that there is no possible way that the examiner can do anything else other than award you the 4 easy marks that you'll pick up for this question. Um, Now, there is another example here, again from the Jamaica Inn paper that you sat before. The extract is there, which you can read again if you wish to pause and do so, but I won't. Down the left-hand side, you'll see there a lot of examples. Now, for these, I have just taken the paraphrasing approach, but actually, of course, you could have used quotations. Either, it doesn't matter as long as it's the information that you're containing. But the reason why I also wanted to do this as an example was just to look at the dubious or wrong answers that I've put on the right-hand side. So the question asks about the weather. In the past, I've seen people write things like, for example, the sky is granite. Now, you could argue about whether that is really about the weather or not. But point is, if you're not quite sure, pick something more obvious, because if you look at the other one, you've got reference to cold, you've got rain, you've got mist, quotations that are much more obviously about it. Things like, it would be dark by 4. Now again, by implication, there's perhaps something about the weather. It implies that the weather is maybe bad, but again, it's not clearly about the weather, so just avoid it. The final one, the seats were damp, might argue that that's as a result of the weather, but again, it's not directly about the weather, so just avoid it. Keep it very, very simple. And that's really, I think, all there is to say for this. That brings us then on to question 2, which is a slightly more complex question to look at. So what are the key things to note then? First of all, it's worth about 8 marks, round about 12 minutes or so in a normal paper. You obviously will have a little bit longer with the extra time that you have. Now this will be on a shorter section of the text, not the whole extract, usually 1 or 2 paragraphs, and which of course it will specify. It also asks you about the writer's use of language. That is the focus of this question. The approach, if this helps, is identical to the one for paper 2 question 3, apart from that one is on the whole text generally, or a larger extract at least, rather than simply 1 or 2 paragraphs. That's the only real difference. Other than that, they're identical in more or less every way. Says, while you can comment on patterns, things like juxtaposition, parallels, or cumulative effects, you're not looking for whole text structural features here. The focus is on language, the focus is on kind of fairly small scale, or at the very least within this paragraph that you're thinking about. Now, the question will always start, how does the writer use language to describe? And then obviously it is only the ending of that will change. So it might be the writer's feelings about Spain, or Harry's trip to Diagon Alley, or whatever that might be. Now, for this, the important thing then is a 1-sentence introduction. Just answer the question literally in a sentence with reference to what you think the writer's purpose or intent is in presenting the focus of the question in that way. And then I've said there 2 detailed paragraphs as a kind of broad sort of target to aim for. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. So, features of a top band response then. The key things then to think about here. So, first of all, it talks about detailed and perceptive understanding of how and why the writer has used the language they have chosen, focusing on that. Detail, so exploring your answers, exploring your ideas in as much detail as you can. It talks about analysing in detail the effects of the writer's choice of language, so what is suggested by it, and the effect on the reader as well. Suggests selecting a carefully chosen range of quotations. Clusters of short, sharp ones can be best, but as I've said before, don't rule out a slightly longer one if you feel that it is important to talk about or useful to talk about. But bear in mind that if you are talking about a longer quotation, well, then you've got to have something really good to say about it. Otherwise, you end up with a piece of analysis that's shorter than the quotation itself, and that obviously is not an effective use of time. Um, and then sophisticated and accurate use of a wide range of techniques or terms for language. That is the key. These are the key things then that you need to bear in mind for this question, and we'll have a look at an example, obviously, shortly to see what that actually looks like in practice. So, how to approach it then? First of all, then, well, for question 2, the extract is printed on the exam paper, the answer paper, so that you can do a separate annotation for it. So you don't necessarily have to do the annotation on the main copy of the extract that you've got separate. Having said that, I've known people who, just without really thinking about it, have inadvertently annotated it on the main copy, and it doesn't really matter. Whichever is obviously is fine. The second thing to note is that you only need a relatively small number of points, so it doesn't need to be as detailed as this. This obviously is an extremely detailed answer. If you can do something like this, wonderful, but you only need a lot less than that. But it's useful if you look at this closely. It's useful to actually be able to see the kind of points that this person was planning to use, and in fact you'll see their actual answer again shortly after this. The other thing is, remember that you are looking for, the literary techniques that we've talked about, things like similes, metaphors, symbols, imagery, motifs, things like that, whatever it may be, as well as things like keywords, adjectives, verbs, or groups and patterns of those, as well as things like sounds, like plosives, sibilants, onomatopoeia. In a kind of perfect paragraph, if you like, you might well narrow your way down from those kind of wider techniques through to word level, through to sound level. If you can get all of those features in, then you are obviously putting yourself in a very strong position. It's also worth noting that for these questions, they do have bullet points, which are, I would argue, of questionable value to you. So it talks about you could include the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms. Well, I think essentially that is what you would be doing anyway. So don't necessarily feel that you have to follow that in any sort of slavish way at all. Just write the piece that you want to, as long as you're kind of generally covering those things. Don't, for example, write a paragraph on each bullet point. That would be quite a very ineffective way of doing it. So, how much to write for this? Well, question 2 gives you 2 sides in the answer booklet. Now, you should aim to fill these, obviously adjusting to some extent depending on the size of your handwriting, if your handwriting is smaller or larger. Now, I said earlier maybe about 2 paragraphs, but again, actually what is more important is the amount of space in the booklet that you fill, really. There is also about a half a page of extra space, as it's labelled, after the end of the question, in case you do need more room. So don't feel that you need to sort of squash it up or anything like that. The space is there if you do go slightly over, but don't go much over, because these questions are only worth 8 marks. They're not that high value to be writing huge length. Right then, now you might find then for these questions, on top of all the sort of terms that you would routinely talk about, you might find that there are a few specifics that may be useful to you. So, if you are sort of struggling to diagnose some of those language features used, the following can be helpful in addition to those sort of things, the routine ones you would usually use. So it might be useful to talk about sentence types. You might want to think about things like statements, interrogatives, imperatives, exclamatives, things like that. That can, again, we talk about similes or metaphors, but that again can be a useful way of referring to a sentence. Try to avoid, in your analysis, commenting on things like the sentence or the phrase, if you can be more specific. The other thing in terms of sentence types, you've got fragments which contain no verb at all. You've got simple sentences that contain only one verb, or multi-clausal sentences which contain more than one verb. Again, that might be something that's useful to you, particularly if you're talking about pace. Often a sequence of short sentences can actually have the effect of slowing things down. Although, having said that, paradoxically, sometimes multi-clausal sentences can do the same thing. But again, it can be useful to think about that and think about how they contribute to it. The other thing then, in terms of phrase types, you might want to think about things like a verb phrase, which is to say a described verb. So, for example, to run quickly, that kind of unit of sort of verb plus adverb, you can call a verb phrase. Similar to that, you've got a noun phrase, which is to say a described noun, like a little boy or a fat man. And again, it's simply a noun plus adjective. Is known as a noun phrase because it's in the sentence it does the same job as a noun, but it's more than one word long. You've got an adverbial phrase which describes a verb. So, for example, to run in a very strange way. The underlined section there, obviously, being the adverbial phrase, the phrase that is describing that verb, describing how that verb is happening. And relatedly, adjectival phrase, one which describes a noun. For example, the puppy was very ugly. If you had simply said the ugly puppy, it would be just an adjective. But because you're actually making a phrase out of that, it's the phrase that's doing the job of it, so it's an adjectival phrase. So these are just some of the things that may be useful if you are questing around for things to label, if you like, a technique to refer to, as we said, particularly at that broader level. Right, well here then we've got an example answer on the Jamaica Inn extract, which we'll have a look at now, and we'll see how that does it. So first of all, if we look at the introduction here, you'll see exactly as described. You've got a one-sentence introduction which relates to the purpose of what the writer is trying to do. It says the writer uses language such as pathetic fallacy throughout the extract to present the weather as an overpowering and malicious force. Straight away, you've got the reference to the language, so it focuses on the topic of the question. You've got the weather, which again is part of the focus, and finally the sort of effect, that's produced, or what the writer is trying to say. Something as simple as that is all that you need for this. Now, to move on to the main paragraph then. So let's read on with this. The weather has an effect on the coach as shown by the simile rocking between the high wheels like a drunken man, which highlights the coach being uncontrollable and also seems to imply there is looming danger. The verb rocking, along with others such as shaking, trembled, and swayed, are all examples of violent imagery which confirms the fact that the coach is weak and powerless compared to the wind. And then it moves on. But before we go on, you see there, it's kind of a classic example. It starts with a simile, it goes on to talk about some verbs, and there's a pattern of verbs that's identified there. Phrases like violent imagery, that's also quite useful in terms of things like imagery. You can categorize that like violent imagery or gentle imagery or fire imagery or whatever it might be. That's a useful thing to bear in mind as well. Anyway, it goes on then. So as the whole body of the coach is shaken and it creaked and groaned, emphasizes the further weaknesses of the coach, especially the onomatopoeic verbs creaked and groaned. So you see, again there, then it's now building on that earlier point. Notice once again more short, sharp quotations being drawn in to do that. Additionally, the coach is seemingly controlled by the driving rain, which shows the effect on the coach that it becomes under the influence of this seemingly higher force, something like that. It moves on then. The weather is also prevented to have a negative effect on the living beings in this extract. For example, when the driver is bent almost double, this adjectival phrase contains plosives which are carried on through plodded and dispirited, which emphasizes to the reader the sheer violence of the weather and the effect it is having. The driver has a faint attempt to gain shelter, which can imply that he has no escape from the harmful weather, and his feeble attempt juxtaposes the force of the weather. His numb fingers show the loss of control of the coach that leads to inevitable doom, seemingly. So there you get a very good idea how that works in terms of the sort of the detailed level of quotations, the focus on the short, sharp ones as we've discussed, the frequent use of terms, the layered analysis. You've got the brief references to the reader as well. The use of the introduction. I think we can all agree that that's a pretty strong example of an answer for that question. Now, actually, that was slightly under 2 sides long. The one thing I probably would say is that in the real exam, that would be a tiny bit short. Another short paragraph, perhaps a similar length to how much we can see on this page here, would have filled up the space. But other than that, excellent. So, a couple of questions then that people might well ask for English language, which is how to revise for this. Now, obviously, doing practice questions, and even if not if not answering them in full, even just the practice annotations can be very valuable, or planning answers as well. Those are really valuable things to do. Now, reading over old extracts and annotations and answers that you've done to revise both the kind of points that can be made, the kind of features that can be identified, and how you've written successfully in the past, that is a very effective approach as well. Because the more of these that you do, the more likely you are to have covered points similar to the ones that you'll be making in the real thing. So, yes, all of these things I think are part of an effective revision strategy. And I'll add as well to that that if you want further practice questions, please let me know. I've got enormous numbers that I can very happily shovel your way. Um, so that I think then is valuable. And as I said, practice questions, but even just the practice annotations and planning, even that alone has good value. Right. Well, what I then want to end this presentation with, really quite briefly, then, are some practice questions for question two and some possible points as well. Now, I won't talk through these. What I will do is I will just sort of scroll through them on about 5 seconds per slide, so that if you wish to have a go at them, you can pause and do so. Now, for the first two practice questions, what you just have is the extract and question, and then on the next slide, there are some tables that have been filled in with some of the possible points that you might have identified. Remembering, of course, what we said, which is that you only need a small number of the possible points, if you like, to have enough to write your two sides on in the exam. Um, that's what it is. So I won't really talk through these. Um, but they're just included for your use. So here then is the first example. So now for this one, I haven't actually included any example points. I've left that to you, but hopefully it's something still that you'll find useful. So this only remains then for me to say thank you as always for listening, and I hope as always that this is something that you have found to be useful and helpful to you. In the next video, I will then pick up on the points for questions 3 and 4. Thank you very much then, and goodbye.